My husband's mistress showed up wearing my grandmother's necklace at the family reunion. My grandmother's ruby necklace disappeared from my jewelry box 3 months ago. Kyle said I must have misplaced it. He helped me look everywhere, even called the insurance company to file a claim. He held me while I cried about losing the last thing she gave me before she died. The necklace was worth $40,000, but that wasn't the point. Grandma wore it to her wedding. My mother wore it to hers, and I wore it to mine. 3 generations of love in one piece of jewelry, and now it was gone. Kyle was so supportive, so understanding. That same week, I noticed other things. His gym bag smelled like perfume I didn't wear. He had charges from restaurants during his supposed work meetings. His phone was suddenly password protected. But the real tell was when his cousin Jake got drunk at a barbecue and almost said something about Kyle's friend. Before Kyle shut him up, I knew then. The necklace didn't disappear. Kyle took it. And I knew exactly who had it now. Her name was Brianna, 23 years old, worked at his company as an intern. I found her Instagram easily enough. There she was, filtered and posed, calling herself a boss babe, and posting motivational quotes about manifesting wealth. No pictures of my necklace, though. She was smarter than that. Or Kyle was. But I knew they'd slip up eventually. People who steal heirlooms always want to show them off. That's the whole point of taking them. So I waited. I hired a private investigator, not for court, just for information. Within 2 weeks, I knew everything. The apartment Kyle rented for her. The trips he claimed were for work. The promises he made about leaving me once his promotion came through. And most importantly, I knew she planned to come to our family reunion. Kyle's family reunion, really. But I'd been going for 8 years. Apparently, Kyle told her it would be there coming out as a couple. He was going to announce our separation and introduce her as his girlfriend. He just hadn't told me about the separation part yet. The reunion was at Kyle's parents' lake house. 60 people would be there. His parents, his 4 siblings, their kids, cousins, aunts, uncles, and the whole extended family. I helped his mother, Diane, plan it every year. This year, I volunteered to handle everything. Diane was thrilled. "You're such a blessing, Haley," she said. "Kyle is lucky to have you." Kyle thought I didn't know anything. The morning of the reunion, he said he had to help set up early. Really? He was picking up Brianna. I arrived right on time, wearing the yellow sundress Kyle's mother bought me last Christmas. I helped Diane in the kitchen, chatted with his sister Lauren about her new baby, and played with his nephews. Normal family stuff. Then Kyle walked in with her. Brianna wore a white dress that cost more than most people's rent, designer heels, and perfect makeup. And around her neck, catching the light like drops of blood, was my grandmother's necklace. The room didn't go silent immediately. Most people didn't notice at first, but Lauren did. She knew that necklace. She was there when I opened the insurance claim. Her eyes went from the necklace to Brianna to me, and her face went white. Kyle was acting like nothing was wrong. Introducing Brianna as his colleague who needed a ride because her car broke down, Brianna played along, smiling sweetly, touching the necklace occasionally like she wanted people to notice it. I waited until everyone was seated for dinner. 60 people around tables on the deck, Kyle's father Bill about to say grace. That's when I stood up. "Before we eat," I said, my voice carrying across the deck, "I have an announcement." Kyle's face tightened. He knew something was off, but not what. 8 years ago, I joined this family, I continued. You welcomed me with open arms. Diane taught me her recipes. Bill fixed my car whenever it broke down. Lauren became my sister. You made me feel like I belonged. People were smiling, probably expecting some emotional thank you speech. Which is why I need you to know that the woman Kyle brought today, Brianna, isn't just his colleague. The smiles started faltering. Kyle stood up. "Haley, what are you doing?" "She's his mistress," I said simply. "He's been paying for her apartment for 6 months. That's where he goes during his work trips." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Diane dropped her wine glass. Bill's face turned purple. Brianna tried to leave, but she was trapped between tables. "But that's not even the best part," I continued. "That necklace she's wearing was reported stolen from my jewelry box 3 months ago." Brianna froze mid-step, her hand halfway to the table edge. The deck went completely silent except for Diane's sharp breath. I watched Kyle's face drain of color as he realized I had been planning this moment carefully. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. 60 pairs of eyes moved from me to Brianna's neck to Kyle and back again. The rubies caught the afternoon sun and threw red light across the white tablecloths. Bill stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and clattered against the deck railing. His face went from purple to deep red as he stared at the necklace. Lauren moved to block Brianna's path to the stairs while pulling out her phone. At least a dozen other family members did the same thing, phones up and cameras pointing at Brianna's neck. I heard the clicking sounds of photos being taken. Brianna's hand flew to the necklace like she wanted to hide it. Kyle finally found his voice and started talking fast. He said Brianna must have bought a similar necklace at a store. His voice shook as he spun the obvious lie. He said lots of antique necklaces look alike, and this was clearly a misunderstanding. I pulled out my phone and showed the insurance photos to the people nearest me. The unique ruby pattern was right there in the photo. 3 large stones in a triangle with smaller ones forming a flower around them. The antique gold setting had my grandmother's initials engraved on the clasp. Everyone could see it was identical to what Brianna wore. People started passing my phone around the tables. Brianna's voice came out trembling and high. She said Kyle gave her the necklace as a gift for her birthday 2 months ago. She said she had no idea it was stolen. Her hands moved to the clasp at the back of her neck. Lauren stepped forward fast and told her not to remove evidence. Her voice carried the authority of someone who watches a lot of legal dramas on TV. Brianna's hands dropped. Diane started crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears running down her face. Bill's voice boomed across the deck and cut through the rising chatter. He demanded that Kyle explain himself immediately. Kyle's 3 siblings moved to stand near their parents. Lauren on one side, Tabitha and Archie on the other. Various aunts and uncles started arguing among themselves about what they were seeing. Some were asking if this was really happening. Others were saying they knew something was wrong with Kyle lately. Kyle's face twisted and his voice got louder. He pointed at me and accused me of ruining a family event. He said I was humiliating him publicly over a misunderstanding. He said I was being vindictive and cruel, and this could have been handled privately. I kept my voice calm and level. I said he ruined our marriage by stealing my grandmother's necklace to give to his mistress. I said the truth coming out at a family gathering was simply the consequence of his choices. I said he had countless opportunities to be honest, and he chose to lie every single time Tabitha started sobbing and ran into the house through the sliding glass door. Her shoulders shook as she disappeared inside. Archie followed her but paused in the doorway to look back at Kyle. The disgust on his face was clear. I realized right then that Kyle's younger siblings were not going to take his side in this. Caroline stood up and announced loudly that she knew something was off about Kyle lately. Her voice carried across the deck. She said she suspected all along that he was acting strange. Several other family members jumped in immediately. Jake mentioned the barbecue incident where Kyle shut him up. An aunt talked about seeing Kyle's car at a restaurant when he claimed to be working late. A cousin said Kyle had been distant and secretive at the last few family events. I watched Kyle's support system fall apart in real time. Each person who spoke took another piece of his credibility. Kyle switched tactics suddenly. He grabbed Brianna's arm and tried to push through the crowd toward the exit. People moved aside instinctively. Bill stepped directly into his path. His voice dropped to a deadly quiet tone that somehow carried further than his earlier shouting. He told Kyle he was not going anywhere until this got sorted out. I saw genuine fear flash across Kyle's face. Bill was a big man and he blocked the entire walkway. Lauren stepped up next to Brianna and asked her directly how old she was. Her questions were pointed and deliberate. Brianna mumbled that she was 23. Lauren asked how she met Kyle. Brianna admitted she was Kyle's intern at work. Several family members gasped. Someone muttered about power dynamics and workplace harassment. Someone else said something about taking advantage. I watched Kyle's professional reputation collapse right alongside his personal one. His face had gone from white to red to a grayish color. Sweat beaded on his forehead even though the lake breeze was cool. Brianna started crying harder and saying she wanted to call her parents. Caroline told her she would probably lose her job when this got out. The satisfaction of watching everything unravel was better than I had imagined. I pulled my phone from my purse and walked toward the house, needing some distance from the noise. My hand stayed steady as I dialed the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher answered on the second ring and asked what I needed to report. I explained that I had located stolen property, a necklace worth $40,000 that I reported missing 3 months ago. She asked if I was in immediate danger and I told her no. I was at a family gathering with 60 people present at a lake house. She said an officer would arrive within the hour to document everything and take a report. I thanked her and ended the call. When I walked back onto the deck, the chaos had shifted into something quieter, but more intense. Diane sat in a chair with her face in her hands. Bill stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder. Lauren still had Brianna trapped near the tables while Kyle paced like a caged animal. Diane looked up when I approached and her eyes were red and swollen. She asked me directly if everything I said was true about the affair and the apartment Kyle was paying for. Her voice cracked on the word, apartment. I unlocked my phone and pulled up the folder where I kept the private investigator's report. I handed it to her without saying anything. She scrolled through the photos of Kyle entering Brianna's building on different dates and times. She looked at the receipts showing rent payments of $2,000 every month for 6 months. She examined the restaurant bills and hotel charges. Her hands shook as she passed the phone to Bill. He looked at each image carefully, and his jaw got tighter with every swipe. Diane asked me how long I had known, and I told her 3 months, since the necklace disappeared. She started crying again and said she was so sorry, that she had no idea Kyle was capable of this. Bill handed my phone back and told Diane they raised him better than this. Brianna suddenly started yelling from where Lauren had her cornered. She said Kyle promised to leave me, that he told her I was cold and didn't understand him, that they were in love and planning a future together. Her voice got higher and more desperate with each word. Lauren actually laughed out loud at that. She asked Brianna if she really thought a married man paying her rent was going to leave his wife for a 23-year-old intern. The contempt in Lauren's voice made Brianna's face turn bright red. Lauren said men like Kyle always promise to leave their wives and they never do, and Brianna was just another stupid girl who believed obvious lies. Brianna started crying harder and tried to push past Lauren, but other family members had moved to block all the exits. One of Kyle's uncles stepped forward and demanded to know where Kyle got the money for a second apartment. The uncle's voice boomed across the deck. He said Kyle's salary couldn't cover 2 rents plus all those restaurant bills. I saw my opportunity and spoke up clearly. I said I would be very interested to see our bank records during the divorce proceedings. Kyle's eyes went wide and his face drained of color. I watched panic replace the anger that had been there moments before. He realized I was already thinking several steps ahead legally while he was still trying to control the immediate situation. The uncle kept pressing and asked if Kyle took out loans or credit cards Diane and Bill didn't know about. Kyle opened his mouth, but nothing came out. 2 police cruisers pulled up the long driveway earlier than I expected. The officers got out and walked toward the deck where 60 people stood in obvious tension. Everyone went quiet as the officers approached. I stepped forward and introduced myself as the person who called. I explained calmly that I was reporting recovered stolen property and gestured toward the necklace that Brianna still wore. Lauren had positioned herself right next to Brianna to make sure she couldn't remove it or run. The older officer asked to see my documentation, and I pulled up the insurance claim on my phone. I showed him the photos I took of the necklace before it disappeared, the claim number and the date I filed the report. The younger officer took notes while the older one examined everything. Brianna spoke up and insisted Kyle gave her the necklace as a gift so she shouldn't have to give it back. Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound confident. The younger officer looked at her and explained that you can't legally gift stolen property. He asked her to remove the necklace carefully. Brianna's hands shook as she reached behind her neck to unclasp it. The rubies caught the afternoon light one last time before she handed it to the officer. He pulled out an evidence bag and sealed the necklace inside. He wrote on the bag with a marker and gave me a receipt. He explained I would be able to retrieve it once they closed their investigation. The older officer turned to Kyle and asked him questions about how he came to possess the necklace. Kyle stammered and said he found it in our house after I reported it missing. The officer asked where specifically he found it. Kyle said in a drawer in the bedroom. The officer asked why he didn't tell me when he found it. Kyle said he wanted to surprise me by having it cleaned first. The officer asked why he gave it to someone else instead of returning it to me. Kyle said Brianna admired it and he let her borrow it. The lies were so obvious that several family members made disgusted noises. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges for theft. I said yes without any hesitation. I looked directly at Kyle while I said it. His face went completely white. The officer explained that because we were married, the theft situation was complicated under state law. But he said the fact that Kyle gave the necklace to a third party and filed a false insurance claim made the case much stronger. He said those actions showed intent to permanently deprive me of the property. Kyle started to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. The officer said they had enough information for now and would be in touch about next steps. They walked back to their cruisers with my necklace secured in evidence. The moment the police cars disappeared down the driveway, the family erupted into chaos again. Everyone started talking over each other. Aunts and uncles argued about what they just witnessed. Cousins took sides. The younger kids looked confused and scared. Bill's voice cut through all of it. He told Kyle to get off his property immediately. He said Kyle couldn't come back until he was ready to tell the complete truth about everything. Diane didn't say anything to contradict him, even though I could see it was destroying her. Her son was kicked out and she just sat there with tears running down her face. Kyle tried one more time to get Brianna to leave with him. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the steps. But Brianna was crying too hard to move. She said she needed to call her parents and figure out what to do. Kyle kept pulling, but she yanked her arm away. Caroline stepped forward and told Brianna loudly that she would probably lose her job when this got out. She said companies don't like intern scandals, and Brianna should start updating her resume. I watched the reality of consequences finally hit Brianna's face. Her whole carefully built life was falling apart in real time, just like mine had been falling apart for months. The difference was I had time to prepare, and she had none. Lauren reached me first, wrapping her arms around me while 2 of Kyle's cousins pressed in close. They asked if I was okay, and told me they couldn't believe what Kyle had done. One cousin said she always thought something seemed off about him lately. Another asked if I needed a place to stay or help getting my things from the house. Their immediate support caught me off guard, even though I'd hoped for exactly this reaction. When I planned the whole confrontation, I thanked them and said I was still figuring things out. Lauren squeezed my hand and told me I could count on her for anything. The solidarity felt real and solid, not just polite family obligation. These women were genuinely disgusted by what Kyle had done, and they weren't hiding it. Diane appeared at my elbow with red eyes and a trembling voice. She asked if we could talk privately. Her face looked small and broken. Nothing like the strong woman who taught me to make her famous pot roast. We walked down to the dock away from the noise and chaos on the deck. The lake stretched out calm and quiet, totally opposite to everything happening behind us. Diane started crying before we even sat down on the wooden bench at the end of the dock. She said she was so sorry for what her son did. She raised him better than this. She was horrified and ashamed and didn't know what to say. The words came out between sobs, and I could see how much this was destroying her. Her son had turned into someone she didn't recognize, and she was watching her family fall apart because of his choices. I sat down next to her and took her hand. I told her I'd valued her as a second mother for 8 years, and that didn't have to change. But I needed her to understand I was divorcing Kyle, and I wouldn't tolerate anyone making excuses for his behavior. Not from her, not from Bill, not from anyone in the family. What Kyle did was wrong, and there was no explanation that would make it okay. Diane nodded hard and squeezed my hand back. She said she supported whatever I needed to do and she wasn't going to defend the indefensible. She wiped her eyes and said Kyle made his bed and now he had to lie in it. Her voice got stronger when she said that, like she was finding her backbone again. She promised she would always think of me as family no matter what happened with the divorce. We walked back up to the deck together and I noticed immediately that Kyle's car was gone from the driveway. Brianna's rental car was gone too. Someone said they left separately about 10 minutes ago. Kyle peeling out fast enough to spray gravel everywhere. Jake came over looking uncomfortable and apologetic. He said he was sorry for not saying something sooner about Kyle's friend. Kyle had sworn him to secrecy, and he didn't realize the extent of what was happening. He thought it was just some stupid flirtation, not a whole apartment and stolen jewelry and plans to leave me. I told him I understood and didn't blame him. Kyle was good at lying and making people complicit in his secrets. Jake looked relieved and said, if I needed anything or anyone to testify about what they saw today, he was there. The family reunion basically ended after that. People started leaving in clusters, gathering their kids and their food containers while talking in low voices about what they'd witnessed. Several family members hugged me on their way out. Kyle's uncle said he'd testify in court if I needed him. An aunt pressed a piece of paper with her phone number into my hand and told me to call anytime. 2 cousins promised they'd write down everything they saw today while it was fresh in their minds. I realized my public confrontation had secured me way more allies than I expected. These people had known Kyle his whole life, but they were choosing my side because what he did was so clearly wrong. The evidence was undeniable, and the betrayal was complete. Lauren found me as the crowd thinned out. She offered to let me stay at her place for a few days, said I shouldn't have to deal with Kyle if he came home. I declined and told her I was going back to my own house because Kyle could find somewhere else to sleep. I paid the mortgage too, and I wasn't giving up my home. Lauren's face got determined, and she said she was coming with me then to make sure he wasn't there and to help me change the locks. She already had her phone out pulling up a locksmith's number before I could argue. She said there was no way she was letting me go home alone after everything that just happened. I felt grateful for her stubbornness. We got to my house 40 minutes later, and Kyle's car was gone from the driveway inside. I could see he'd been there recently. Dresser drawers hung open in the bedroom. Half his clothes were missing from the closet. His toiletries were gone from the bathroom. He'd packed in a hurry, grabbing things randomly without any organization. There was a note on the kitchen counter in his handwriting that just said we need to talk. I picked it up, walked directly to the trash can, and threw it away without a second thought. Lauren was already on the phone with the locksmith, pacing in my living room while she explained what we needed. She gave them my address and said it was urgent. They promised to send someone within 2 hours. The locksmith showed up in 90 minutes, a middle-aged guy with a toolbox and a kind face. He changed all the exterior locks while Lauren and I sat at the kitchen table drinking wine and eating pizza we'd ordered. Lauren started telling me stories about Kyle as a kid. How he always wanted the biggest piece of cake at birthday parties. How he threw fits when he didn't get his way. How their mom used to make excuses for his bad behavior because he was the oldest. I listened and realized there were probably red flags I'd missed because I was too in love to see them clearly. The entitled behavior had always been there. I just thought it was confidence. The manipulation had always been there. I just thought it was charm. Lauren apologized for not warning me before we got married, but said she'd hoped he'd grown out of it. Over the next week, I made calls and sent emails from my newly secured house. Lauren gave me the name of a divorce attorney one of her friends used. The attorney was a sharp woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and no-nonsense attitude. She reviewed my documentation during our first meeting, spreading the private investigator's report and police statements across her desk. She looked at photos of Brianna wearing the necklace. She examined bank statements showing the apartment payments. She read through text messages the investigator had obtained. When she finished, she sat back and told me I had an excellent case. The theft was documented by professionals. The affair was documented by professionals. The financial deception was clear in black and white. She said we could push for a very favorable settlement given Kyle's behavior. Kyle's calls and texts started the day after the reunion and never stopped. My phone buzzed constantly with his name on the screen. Sometimes he apologized and begged me to talk to him. Sometimes he accused me of humiliating him on purpose and ruining his life. Sometimes he tried to explain or justify what he'd done. Sometimes he just sent question marks or asked if I was there. I screenshot every single message and forwarded them to my attorney. She told me not to respond to anything and to let all communication go through lawyers once we filed papers. She said his erratic messages would actually help our case by showing his unstable mental state and lack of remorse. So I watched the texts pile up and said nothing back, just collected evidence while Kyle spiraled. 3 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end identified herself as someone from the insurance company handling my claim for the necklace. She asked if I could provide information about the police report since the necklace had been recovered. I explained the whole situation calmly, how my husband stole it and gave it to his mistress, how the police took it as evidence at the family reunion. She was quiet for a moment, then said they would close the claim without any payout since the property was recovered. But she also mentioned they were flagging Kyle's involvement in their fraud database, which could affect his ability to get insurance in the future. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a small surge of satisfaction that Kyle's actions were creating permanent marks on his record, in ways he probably hadn't considered. The next afternoon, Caroline called me with barely contained glee in her voice. Brianna's Instagram had gone private overnight after several family members apparently found her page and left comments about the affair. Caroline read me a few of the comments people had screenshot before Brianna locked everything down, and they were harsh but honest about what she'd done. I told Caroline I didn't support harassment, which was true, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing Brianna's carefully built online image was ruined. She'd spent months posting filtered photos and motivational quotes about success, and now everyone who looked her up would know she was the kind of person who wore stolen jewelry to family events. My attorney called the following Monday to tell me she'd filed the divorce papers. She cited adultery and was seeking a larger share of marital assets based on Kyle's financial deception. Within 48 hours, Kyle's attorney responded with an aggressive counterclaim, trying to paint me as vindictive and claiming I'd orchestrated the reunion confrontation to embarrass him publicly. My attorney actually laughed when she read it to me over the phone, saying his position was extremely weak given all the documented evidence we had. The private investigator's report, the police statements, the insurance fraud flag, and testimony from 60 witnesses made Kyle's claims look desperate and false. 2 weeks after the reunion, Lauren texted me during my lunch break at work. Kyle had been put on administrative leave from his company pending an investigation into his relationship with Brianna. Someone had apparently reported the intern situation to HR, probably one of his co-workers who'd heard about the reunion disaster through the family grapevine. The company was taking it seriously given the potential liability of a manager having an affair with an intern he supervised. Lauren said the HR department was interviewing people and reviewing Kyle's personnel files and company credit card statements. I forwarded the information to my attorney, who added it to our growing evidence file. That same week, Diane called me in the evening while I was making dinner. Her voice was strained and tired when she told me Kyle had shown up at their house that afternoon, begging for money and a place to stay. Bill had apparently told him no on both counts until he stopped lying and took actual responsibility for what he'd done. Diane said it broke her heart to see her son like that, but she and Bill agreed they couldn't enable his behavior by bailing him out of consequences he'd brought on himself. I told her I was grateful they were holding him accountable despite their pain, and she started crying on the phone, saying she never thought she'd have to choose between supporting her son and doing what was right. The next morning, I met with my attorney to go through our joint finances in detail. We spread bank statements and credit card bills across her conference table, and I watched the numbers add up in ways that made my stomach turn. Kyle had spent over $30,000 on Brianna in just 6 months. The apartment rent was $2,000 a month. There were charges from expensive restaurants I'd never been to, shopping trips at stores I'd never heard of, a weekend vacation to Miami that happened during a work trip I'd known nothing about. Everything was charged to credit cards I thought were for legitimate business expenses. My attorney made notes on every transaction, photographing receipts and building a timeline of Kyle's spending. She said this level of financial deception would absolutely support my claim for a larger share of assets in the settlement. The financial betrayal hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the affair or the stolen necklace anymore. It was seeing in black and white how Kyle had systematically taken money that should have gone toward our future and spent it on another woman. I spent that entire weekend on Lauren's couch, crying and drinking wine while she sat with me. She didn't try to fix anything or tell me it would be okay. She just let me be angry and sad, occasionally refilling my wine glass and handing me tissues. At one point, I told her I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, and she reminded me that Kyle had been deliberately hiding it, and I wasn't stupid for trusting my husband. I realized how much I needed someone to just witness my grief without trying to make it smaller or more manageable. The following Tuesday, Lauren called with news from the family grapevine Kyle's company had completed their investigation and terminated him for violating their fraternization policy and creating a hostile work environment. Apparently, the investigation had turned up other complaints from female employees about Kyle's behavior that hadn't been formally reported before. Lauren said Kyle was furious and blaming me for ruining his career, telling family members that none of this would have happened if I hadn't made a scene at the reunion. My attorney added his termination letter to our evidence file when I forwarded her the information. Around the same time, I heard through Caroline that Brianna had moved back to her parents' house in another state. Her Instagram remained private and her LinkedIn profile had been completely deleted. Caroline seemed disappointed that the drama was dying down, but I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. Brianna was facing real consequences for her choices, losing her job and her reputation, and having to move home in shame. But she was also only 23, and probably really had believed Kyle's lies about leaving me and building a life with her. I didn't forgive her for wearing my grandmother's necklace, but I could acknowledge she'd been young and stupid enough to trust a married man who was clearly a practiced liar. 3 months after the reunion, my attorney called to tell me she was meeting with Kyle's attorney for settlement negotiations. She asked what my bottom line was. What I absolutely needed from the divorce. I told her I wanted the house, my retirement accounts, and 60% of our other assets given Kyle's deception and theft. She said that was reasonable, and she'd push for it. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. My attorney called me afterward and reported that Kyle wanted to split everything 50-50. His position was that the affair shouldn't affect property division, because that was a personal matter separate from finances. My attorney had argued back that his financial deception and theft absolutely justified a larger share for me, and she'd presented all our documentation of his spending on Brianna. Kyle's attorney had asked for time to discuss options with his client, which my attorney said was code for Kyle realizing he had a weak position and needing to figure out his next move. 2 days later, Diane called me. I saw her name on my phone screen and almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding her wouldn't make anything easier. She got straight to the point, asking if I'd consider being more generous with the settlement to avoid dragging things through court for months. Her voice sounded tired and sad, like she'd been crying before she called. She said Kyle was really struggling without a job and facing legal bills, and maybe if I gave him a fairer split, he could get back on his feet faster. I took a breath before responding, keeping my voice gentle but firm. I told her I understood she was caught in the middle and I was sorry for that. But Kyle made his choices when he stole my grandmother's necklace and spent $30,000 on another woman. Those were his decisions, and now he had to live with the results. I wasn't going to make his life easier just because facing the truth was hard for him. Diane was quiet for a moment, then said she understood and she'd tell Kyle I wasn't interested in negotiating. She apologized again before hanging up, and I felt bad for her, but not bad enough to change my mind. The following week, my attorney called with news about the police investigation. They were filing charges against Kyle for insurance fraud, related to the false claim he helped me file for the necklace. The theft charge was dropped because of complicated marital property laws, but the insurance fraud was solid. Kyle had signed documents claiming the necklace was stolen when he knew exactly where it was, and that was a crime regardless of who technically owned the jewelry. The prosecutor told my attorney that Kyle was looking at possible fines and probation, maybe even jail time if he didn't take a deal. My attorney asked if I was okay with them moving forward with charges, and I said absolutely yes. Kyle had held me while I cried about losing my grandmother's necklace, had helped me fill out insurance paperwork, had played the supportive husband while knowing he'd given that necklace to his mistress. He deserved whatever consequences came from that level of lying. 3 weeks after that, I attended Kyle's plea hearing at the county courthouse. My attorney said I didn't have to go, but I wanted to see it happen. I sat in the back of the courtroom wearing a navy blue dress and watched Kyle walk in with his lawyer. He was wearing a cheap gray suit that didn't fit him right, probably bought off the rack because he couldn't afford his usual tailored clothes anymore. His hair needed cutting and he looked thinner, smaller somehow, nothing like the man who used to command a room. The judge asked him how he pleaded to the insurance fraud charge, and Kyle said guilty in a voice I could barely hear. His lawyer had worked out a deal for 2 years, probation, community service, and restitution to the insurance company for their investigation costs. The judge accepted the plea and gave Kyle a lecture about integrity and the seriousness of fraud. I watched Kyle's shoulders hunch forward as the judge spoke, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This was the man who had searched our house with me, who had called the insurance company himself, who had held me when I cried. Now he was standing in front of a judge accepting responsibility for lying to everyone. My attorney reached out to Kyle's attorney the day after the plea hearing with our final settlement offer. We wanted the house, my retirement accounts, and 60% of all other marital assets based on Kyle's financial misconduct and fraud. Kyle's attorney tried to fight it, sending back a counteroffer for a 50-50 split with some complicated arrangement about the house. My attorney responded with all our documentation of Kyle's spending on Brianna, his fraud conviction, and his termination from work for policy violations. She told me Kyle's attorney went quiet for 2 days before calling back to say Kyle would accept our terms. He probably realized he couldn't afford to keep fighting with no income and mounting legal bills from both the criminal case and the divorce. My attorney drafted the settlement agreement and sent it over for signatures. Kyle signed it without requesting any changes, and just like that, the financial part of the divorce was settled. I got the house I'd helped decorate for 8 years, my retirement savings that Kyle hadn't managed to spend on his mistress, and a significant portion of everything else we'd built together. Lauren called me the same week the settlement was finalized. She said she needed to tell me something about Kyle and the family. Apparently, Archie and Tabitha had completely cut him off, refusing to see him or answer his calls or texts. Archie had told their mom that he couldn't respect a man who treated his wife the way Kyle treated me, and Tabitha said she was embarrassed to be related to him after what happened at the reunion. Lauren said Kyle had tried to show up at Archie's apartment, and Archie wouldn't even open the door, just yelled through it that Kyle should leave. Tabitha had blocked Kyle's number entirely and told mutual friends not to pass along any messages from him. Lauren sounded almost sad telling me this, like she felt bad for Kyle even though she was on my side. She said their parents were trying to stay neutral, but it was hard when 2 of their kids wanted nothing to do with their oldest brother. I told Lauren I was sorry the family was divided, but I wasn't sorry Kyle was facing social consequences. He'd spent months lying to everyone, and people were allowed to decide they didn't want liars in their lives. Actions had to mean something, or what was the point of anything? 5 months after the reunion, I got a call from the police department saying my grandmother's necklace was released from evidence. The case was closed with Kyle's guilty plea, and I could pick up the necklace anytime during business hours. I drove to the station the next day, my hands shaking a little on the steering wheel. A clerk brought out a plastic evidence bag with the necklace inside, had me sign some forms and handed it over. I carried it to my car before opening the bag, and when I finally held the necklace in my hands, the weight of it hit me hard. 3 generations of women had worn this necklace on their wedding days. My grandmother had clasped it around my mother's neck, and my mother had clasped it around mine. It had survived wars and moves and decades of life, and then Kyle had stolen it to give to a 23-year-old intern. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Not sad tears exactly, just this overwhelming release of everything I'd been holding in the necklace was back. I'd fought for it and won, but it would never feel the same as it did before. I took the necklace to a jeweler the following week to have it cleaned and checked for any damage. The jeweler was an older man with careful hands who examined each ruby under his magnifying glass. He commented on the beautiful workmanship, asking about the history of the piece. I found myself telling him the whole story right there in his shop. How my grandmother wore it at her wedding in 1952. How my mother wore it in 1978. How I wore it in 2015. How my husband stole it and gave it to his mistress. How she wore it to a family reunion. How I exposed them both in front of 60 people. The jeweler listened with his eyebrows getting higher and higher, making appropriate sounds of shock and outrage. When I finished, he said any man who would steal a family heirloom like that wasn't worth the air he breathed. He cleaned the necklace carefully, checking every link and clasp, and refused to charge me for the service. He said it was the least he could do after what I'd been through, and I almost started crying again in his shop. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Diane called to invite me to dinner with the family. She made it very clear that Kyle was not invited and wouldn't be there. She said I was still family regardless of the divorce, and she wanted me at their table like always. Her voice was warm but careful, like she was worried I'd say no. I told her I was really touched by the invitation, and I appreciated her making it clear about Kyle, but I needed some space from family gatherings while I healed. Being around everyone would just remind me of the reunion and everything that happened after, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Diane said she understood completely, and the invitation stood for any future holiday when I felt ready. She told me she loved me, and she was proud of how strong I'd been through everything. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and when we hung up, I felt grateful that I hadn't lost her, even though I'd lost her son. The divorce was finalized 6 months after the reunion, on a cold Tuesday morning in February. We met in a conference room at the courthouse with our attorneys and a judge who barely looked at us. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes. The judge confirmed we'd both signed the settlement agreement, asked if we understood the terms, and declared our marriage dissolved. Kyle sat across the table from me looking tired and angry, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. He never looked at me once during the entire proceeding. When it was time to sign the final papers, my hand was steady. I watched Kyle sign his name in quick, harsh strokes, and then I signed mine in the careful cursive my grandmother had taught me. The judge stamped the papers and said we were officially divorced, and that was it. 8 years of marriage ended in a courthouse conference room on a Tuesday morning. I walked out feeling relieved instead of sad, like I'd finally closed a door that should have been closed months ago. I kept the necklace in my jewelry box for about a week after the divorce was finalized, but every time I looked at it, I felt sick. The rubies that used to remind me of my grandmother's love now reminded me of Kyle's betrayal, of Brianna wearing it at the reunion, of everything that had been stolen from me. I couldn't wear it and I couldn't display it, but I also couldn't sell it or give it away. It was still my grandmother's necklace, still 3 generations of family history, still worth $40,000. I decided to put it in a safety deposit box at my bank, somewhere secure where I wouldn't have to see it every day. The bank officer helped me set up the box and I placed the necklace inside, closing the small metal door with a sense of finality. Maybe someday I'd be ready to take it out again, to wear it or pass it on to someone I loved. But right now it carried too much weight, too much pain mixed in with the love. It was safer locked away where Kyle's betrayal couldn't touch it anymore, where I could decide what it meant to me on my own terms and in my own time. Lauren started texting me a few days after the divorce was final, just checking in at first, then sending funny memes and asking if I wanted to grab coffee. We met at a small cafe near my house the following Tuesday, and she hugged me before we even sat down. She ordered us both lattes, and we talked for 2 hours about everything except Kyle at first. Just normal stuff about her kids and my work and a TV show we both watched. Then she got quiet and said she was glad I was still in her life, that she'd been worried I'd disappear after everything. I told her she wasn't responsible for her brother's choices, and I valued her friendship separate from him. She teared up a little and squeezed my hand across the table. After that, we met every week. Same cafe, same Tuesday morning time slot. We texted almost daily, sending each other photos of our coffee cups or complaining about traffic or sharing random thoughts. It felt genuine in a way my marriage never had, like I could be myself without performing. A month after the divorce, I finally called the therapist number my insurance company gave me. The receptionist scheduled me for the following week, and I almost canceled 3 times before the appointment. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm voice, and she didn't push me to talk about anything I wasn't ready for. Our first session, I mostly cried and apologized for crying, and she handed me tissues and said crying was allowed. Over the next few months, we worked through everything: the betrayal and the lies and my broken ability to trust anyone. She helped me understand that Kyle's actions reflected his character. Not my worth as a person, I knew that intellectually from the start, but she helped me believe it deeper, in the parts of myself that still wondered what I'd done wrong. 8 months after the reunion, I ran into Jake at the grocery store while I was buying vegetables in the produce section. He looked uncomfortable at first, like he wanted to pretend he hadn't seen me, but I waved and he came over. We chatted for a few minutes about nothing important, and then he mentioned that Kyle was working at a much smaller company now for way less money. He said Kyle was living in a studio apartment across town and seemed pretty miserable. I didn't feel happy hearing that exactly, but I also didn't feel guilty. Kyle brought all of it on himself with his choices. Jake apologized again for not speaking up sooner, and I told him I understood family loyalty made things complicated. Around the same time, I started reaching out to friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I called my college roommate who I hadn't talked to in 3 years. I texted my former coworker who used to invite me to happy hours I always declined. I showed up at book club for the first time in forever. They all welcomed me back without making me feel bad about disappearing, and several of them admitted they never liked Kyle, but didn't know how to say anything. One friend said she'd tried to tell me once that Kyle seemed controlling, but I'd gotten defensive and changed the subject. Hearing that made me realize how slowly and carefully Kyle had isolated me from everyone who might have noticed what he was doing. Caroline called me on a random Thursday evening, clearly excited to share gossip. She said Kyle had been trying to date, but women kept finding out about what happened and losing interest. Apparently, the story of the reunion had spread through social circles and people talked. One woman had Googled him before their second date and found someone's blog post about the whole thing. Caroline was practically gleeful telling me this, and while I didn't take pleasure in Kyle's struggles exactly, I also thought reputation mattered, and he was learning that actions had consequences in a connected community. 3 weeks later, my boss called me into her office, and I had a moment of panic thinking something was wrong. Instead, she offered me the promotion I'd been hoping for before everything fell apart with Kyle. She said I'd seemed more focused and confident in recent months, and my work had really improved. I thanked her and tried not to cry. And later in my car, I realized that being free of Kyle's constant manipulation had actually made me better at my job. I had energy for work again, instead of spending it all managing his moods and lies. For Christmas, I decided to host a small dinner at my house instead of spending the holiday alone. I invited Lauren, Archie, and Tabitha, plus 3 of my friends who didn't have family nearby. We cooked too much food and ate until we were uncomfortable, then played board games and laughed about stupid things. Tabitha told embarrassing stories about her college professors. Archie did impressions of their dad that made Lauren snort wine out of her nose. My friend told a story about her disastrous Tinder date that had us all crying with laughter. Sitting at my table surrounded by people who chose to be there, I realized this felt more real than any holiday dinner during my marriage. Kyle and I had always performed for each other, playing roles of the happy couple, and this was just people being themselves. 2 days after Christmas, I got a card in the mail from Diane. Inside, she'd written a note acknowledging that the day would have been my 9th wedding anniversary, and saying she loved me and supported me no matter what. The gesture made me cry, but they were good tears this time. Grateful tears for a relationship that survived, despite everything her son had done. I called her that evening, and we talked for an hour about nothing important, just normal mother and daughter conversation, and I felt thankful I hadn't lost her. On my grandmother's birthday in February, I went to the bank and took the necklace out of the safety deposit box. I I brought it home and spread old photo albums across my kitchen table, finding pictures of her wearing it at her wedding, at my mother's wedding, at my wedding. I looked at the necklace in my hands, and then at her face in the photos, young and then middle-aged and then elderly. I told her out loud that I was sorry the necklace got caught up in such ugly circumstances, but I'd protected it in the end, just like she'd protected me when she was alive. I put it back in the box the next day, still not ready to wear it or display it, but feeling more at peace with what it represented. A year after the reunion, Lauren came over for our regular Tuesday coffee, but we stayed at my house instead of going out. She seemed nervous about something, and finally told me that Kyle had been asking family members if they thought I'd ever speak to him again. I actually laughed out loud at that. The idea so ridiculous I couldn't help it. I told her absolutely not, that Kyle had countless chances to be honest with me, and he chose deception every single time. Some bridges deserved to stay burned, and that one was Ash. Lauren looked relieved and said she'd told him the same thing, and we moved on to talking about her daughter's upcoming birthday party. A few months after my conversation with Lauren about Kyle asking if I'd talk to him, I downloaded a dating app just to see what was out there. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just wanted to remember what it felt like to have someone show actual interest in me without lying about where they were going or who they were with. I went on a handful of coffee dates and one dinner that lasted 3 hours because the guy was funny and asked real questions about my life. On our second date, he asked about my divorce in that careful way people do when they're not sure if it's too personal. I gave him the short version about the affair and the stolen necklace, leaving out the dramatic family reunion part, and he shook his head and said any man who would steal from his wife is an idiot. The comment made me smile, not because I needed validation, but because it was nice to hear someone state the obvious without making excuses for Kyle's behavior. We went out a few more times, but it fizzled naturally, and I was okay with that because I wasn't ready for anything heavy anyway. I went on dates with 2 other guys over the next couple months, nothing that turned into a relationship, just practice at being myself around new people without the weight of Kyle's manipulation hanging over every interaction. In May, I got a text from Tabitha inviting me to her college graduation ceremony. She said the whole family would be there, and she really wanted me to come because I was still her sister, even though her brother screwed everything up. I bought a plane ticket that same day, and showed up at the university stadium wearing a blue dress and carrying flowers. The ceremony lasted 2 hours in uncomfortable folding chairs, but when Tabitha walked across that stage in her cap and gown, I stood up and cheered so loudly that Lauren turned around from 3 rows ahead and grinned at me. Afterward, we found Tabitha in the crowd of graduates taking photos, and she ran over and hugged me tight, thanking me for still being part of her life. I told her I loved her, and I was proud of her, and I meant every word, because she'd chosen integrity over easy family loyalty, just like Lauren had. We all went to dinner at a nice restaurant, me and Lauren and Archie and Tabitha and their parents, and nobody mentioned Kyle even though his absence was obvious. Diane squeezed my hand under the table at one point, and I squeezed back, and it felt like we were all moving forward together despite the damage her son had caused. On the flight home, I thought about the necklace sitting in its safety deposit box at the bank. I'd been avoiding really dealing with my feelings about it. Just keeping it locked away like that solved the problem. But sitting on that plane at 30,000 feet, I admitted to myself that the necklace would probably never feel the same way it did before Kyle stole it. The physical object was recovered and protected, but the emotional meaning had gotten complicated and messy. My grandmother wore it at her wedding full of hope and love. My mother wore it at hers with the same feelings. I wore it at mine thinking I was starting a life with someone honest and good, and that turned out to be a lie. The necklace witnessed 3 generations of love, but it also witnessed betrayal now, and I couldn't separate those things completely, no matter how much I wanted to. I decided that was okay though, because life is complicated, and things don't always get to stay pure and simple. The necklace's story included Kyle's chapter now, and I had to make peace with that instead of pretending it didn't happen. At my next therapy session, I brought up the necklace and my complicated feelings about its meaning. My therapist asked what I thought I might do with it eventually, whether I'd want to wear it again or pass it to someone else. I said I'd been thinking about maybe giving it to a future daughter or niece someday, creating new positive connections to balance out the negative ones Kyle added. The idea appealed to me because it meant the necklace's story would continue beyond Kyle's betrayal, proving that one person's actions don't get to define a family treasure forever. My therapist said that sounded like a healthy way to reclaim the necklace's meaning without pretending the theft never happened. We talked about how healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means integrating difficult experiences into your life story without letting them control your future. I left that session feeling lighter, like I'd given myself permission to let the necklace be complicated instead of trying to force it back to what it was before. 3 weeks later, Lauren called with news she'd heard through family channels. Kyle's probation had ended, and he was apparently trying to rebuild his life in a different city about 4 hours away. He'd found a job at some small company and was renting a cheap apartment and basically starting over where nobody knew his history. Lauren asked if I wanted details, but I realized I didn't care about the specifics. I felt nothing when she told me this information. No anger or satisfaction or curiosity. Just complete indifference, like she was telling me about a stranger's life. I told Lauren that was probably the truest sign I'd moved on, when news about Kyle generated zero emotional response. She agreed and said she was glad I'd reached that point because it meant he'd lost his power to affect my emotional state. We changed the subject to planning a weekend trip together, something fun and relaxing just for us. The beach trip happened in June. Just me and Lauren driving 3 hours to a coastal town neither of us had visited before. We rented a small house right on the water and spent 2 days drinking wine, walking on the beach and talking about everything and nothing. She told me stories about her kids and complained about her husband leaving dishes in the sink. Normal, everyday stuff that felt good because it was real. On our last night, we sat on the deck watching the sunset, and she said she was proud of how I'd handled everything with Kyle. I told her I was grateful she'd chosen integrity over blind family loyalty, that she could have taken her brother's side and made everything harder. We raised our wine glasses and toasted to women who support each other, and I felt lucky to have her in my life as a real friend, and not just an in-law obligation. On the 2-year anniversary of the reunion, I took myself out to a nice dinner at a restaurant downtown. I wore the navy dress I'd bought with money from the divorce settlement, the one that cost more than I used to let myself spend on clothes. I ordered the expensive entree and dessert, and didn't feel guilty about it. Sitting there alone at my table, I thought about the woman I was 2 years ago, crying over a missing necklace while her husband comforted her and pretended to help search for it. That woman didn't know she was lied to every single day. That woman was performing a marriage instead of living one. I felt proud of the woman I'd become, someone who refuses to accept lies and who fights for what matters even when it's hard and messy and public. Now I'm building a life that's genuinely mine, not performed for someone else or made smaller to make a man feel bigger. I work hard at my job and get recognized for it. I spend time with people who actually care about me. I make decisions based on what I want, not what someone else needs me to want. The necklace sits in its safety deposit box at the bank, recovered and protected, waiting for whatever comes next. Someday I'll decide what to do with it, whether to wear it again or pass it to someone younger or just keep it safe as a reminder of what I survived. For now, it's enough to know I fought for what mattered and won, that I didn't let Kyle's betrayal destroy something precious just because he tried to. I'm building something real now, and that feels better than any piece of jewelry ever could.